Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. I thank you all for joining us for this conversation today, those of you who are here in the room and those joining us online. I hear we have over 200 people online for this event today, so thank those of you who have come out on this cold DC morning to join us here in person. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, the Wilson Center was established around 5 decades ago to strengthen the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. Our unique center is scholarship-driven and fiercely nonpartisan. We go beyond advocacy, data, and information, and look at scholarship to develop options and recommendations that decision makers on both sides of the aisle can trust in and utilize. We have an obligation to not duplicate what others are doing and to prioritize the most pressing issues and opportunities in ways that add value. For the Wilson Center Africa program, we work to address some of the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations. Our work helps to inform policy that helps to build stronger, mutually beneficial US-Africa relations and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. We thank you all so much for joining us for this launch of our Africa Year in Review publication. Every year, the Wilson Center Africa program partners with policymakers, practitioners, scholars, and African experts to publish a series of short essays on the most impactful developments across the African continent, in US-Africa relations, and on Africa's role and future in the global arena over the past year. This edition this year is our largest to date. We have over 40 cross-cutting contributions. Our discussion today with our dynamic panel will examine the successes and challenges that are highlighted in the publication and engage in discussion covering a wide range of issues from governance to security to development, democracy and elections, trade, regional conflicts, and the ongoing coups on the continent. But before I introduce our first speaker, who will give us sort of set the stage for the discussion, I want to extend my deep gratitude to all our contributors. We received a lot of responses to our call for publications. Unfortunately, we couldn't publish all of them. So thank you all who submitted and thank you all who contributed to the Africa Year in Review. I would also like to thank our Africa program staff, including Kyra Chambers, who is in the back over there, Niat Afewerki, who is running around somewhere here, and our program interns, Juliet Lancy and Toriana Eccles. Their work, research, and communication support helped put together a stellar publication. I also want to thank Mr. Tobias Glocksman. Unfortunately, Toby is home today with the flu, but Toby is our senior State Department diplomatic fellow, and he provided insightful comments and just editorial assistance throughout the entire publication. So Toby, I know you're watching us today. Thank you so much for all your help. And last but not least, I also want to thank our communications coordinator, Sherry Ayers. Many of you who submitted publications got a chance to coordinate with her. She went back and forth with all the authors, making sure that we were able to put this publication together. So my immense thanks to all of you, all the contributors, Africa program staff, and everyone working together to help us put this publication together. So let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is no stranger to the Wilson Center. So in many ways, I'm inviting Chidi back to the Wilson Center. So Chidi Blyden is the new, most recent Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. As the Deputy CEO, Ms. Blyden supports the CEO in the daily management of the agency and delivering on MCC's mission to reduce global poverty through economic growth. Before joining MCC, Ms. Blyden served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs, where she managed the Department of Defense's relationship with 53 African nations. I encourage you to read the rest of her bio in the handouts over there. It's really extensive, and I don't want to stay here the whole day going through your bio, Chidi. So I'd like to welcome Chidi to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, the director of the Africa program, my dear friend Oge, for this opportunity to reflect as a community on Africa's progress and challenges over the last year, but more importantly, discuss its opportunities for the future. This year's Africa in Review publication brought together, as it always does, a unique combination of experts from the private sector, government, and academia, whose contributions mirrored the complexity of events we witnessed on the continent in 2023. The continent grappled with many cross-cutting issues over the backdrop of strategic competition, democratic backsliding, geoeconomic fragmentation, slowed economic growth, and stubborn poverty. Despite these troubling trends, the report also forecasts a much bigger and more optimistic story about the resilient and promising long-term future of the African continent. Despite African countries still recovering from multiple multi-year shocks, including the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, disruptions to global supply chains due to the war in Ukraine, and a tightening of global financial conditions, African economies remained resilient and were able to stabilize their economies with a projected growth of 4.1% at the end of 2023 and going into 2024. Take a look to your left and to your right, and for those of you who are on the screen, take a look around you. If you're not African right now, just know that by 2050, someone you know will likely be African on this globe. The United Nations projects that by 2050, Africa's population will reach close to 2.5 billion people, and this would mean that more than 25% of the world's population will be African. This data point represents one of the region's greatest opportunities. It embodies a growing pool of human talent and ingenuity, coupled with a large market size. This is an important driver of economic dynamism that could benefit the world. If Africa's human capital is not properly harnessed with education and health infrastructure, that potential may not be realized. Demographic forecasts indicate that at some point beyond 2050, 13 of the top 20 most populous cities in the world will be located in the global south. By 2100, 13 of the top 20 are predicted to be on the African continent. This will create economic opportunities and empower African societies. Now, I'm not saying anything new through these statistics, but they do reveal a critical reality that is becoming harder to ignore. Africa's importance is not fading into the background. If anything, Africa is becoming more central to the world that we live in. When the White House unveiled the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa in the fall of 2022, it directed the U.S. government and its agencies to engage with African nations through 4 lines of effort: delivering democratic and security dividends, advancing pandemic recovery and economic opportunity, supporting conservation, climate change adaptations for strengthening energy transition, and strengthening our bilateral and multilateral relationships and partnerships with an emphasis on seeking mutually beneficial partners. We could not have predicted the tumultuous year on the continent that would call into question and test the commitment, capacity, and tools of the U.S. government in carrying out these goals. Nonetheless, the U.S. employed its whole-of-government approach in responding to challenges such as persistent security threats and conflicts, food insecurity, challenges to democratic order, climate change, and governance. We worked within and across our interagency to coordinate the 3Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense, and the private sector to respond to these challenges and seize the opportunities to further integrate Africa's business, economic, and trade potential. As a follow-up to the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, it brought a stream of high-level engagement from the Biden-Harris administration officials to the continent, the launch of digital transformation with Africa to help close the gap on technology and the digital divide, and over $16.2 billion to advance two-way trade and investment partnerships to bolster Africa's role in the global economy. Through the global economy through Prosper Africa, and over $2 billion in investment in infrastructure through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment through PGI. With financing from the Development Finance Corporation and grants through the selection of Millennium Challenge Corporation's Compact and Threshold programs, our engagement with the African continent through business, trade, finance, and development has only grown. All of this is to help facilitate the type of growth and investment necessary to keep pace with the growing population and economic needs of the fastest growing continent. Now, MCC is a critical piece of the U.S. interagency structure needed to mobilize further support, leadership, and investment to bring progress to scale in our partner countries. MCC's mission is simple: to reduce global poverty through economic growth. MCC maximizes results by leveraging data and lessons learned to connect decision makers with the needs of the people. This formula connects the needs of the people, the leadership of the government, data, and respect for MCC's partner countries' decision-making on their development journey. MCC provides grant funding to select countries that demonstrate a commitment to good governance and investing in their people. Since our establishment 20 years ago, MCC has invested $17 billion in grant dollars to 47 countries across the globe, which is expected to benefit over 300 million people. And we are proud that over 2/3 of our portfolio has been in Africa, delivering over $10 billion in targeted time-bound institutional policy reforms and infrastructure investments across the continent. Our goal is to enable the development of implementable solutions centered around what African nations desire and believe we as partners can provide. As MCC works to apply its economic development toolkit in more places, the agency must consider opportunities to adjust its tools and embrace a broader range of interventions as countries ask the agency to focus on new challenges, including addressing issues specific to urban centers, climate change, maximizing regional integration, pursuing reform-heavy threshold programs after compacts, and expanding the digital economy. Many of the topics that were talked about in the Africa Year publication. In closing, as we look into the future and to be a relevant partner, we need to embrace where the continent is, and what it's ready for while preparing for where it's going. The pace of change may mean that traditional development paths are no longer viable. Rapidly advancing technology and artificial intelligence and communications is also dramatically changing the nature of the private sector. This is an opportunity. African thought leaders from the continent and diaspora, like all of you gathered here and online, will be the key to Africa's future with comprehensive solutions and decisive action to move these discussions forward. And with that, I thank you.
Can I invite our other panelists to please come up? And our panelists in South Africa to appear on the screen. So while we're waiting for Fonte to come online, Chidi, thank you again for the wonderful remarks. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other members of our panel today. So I'm going to start with Fonte Akum, who has appeared on screen. So Fonte is the Executive Director of the Institute of Security Studies based in Pretoria, South Africa. He is the former head of the Lake Chad Basin Program in the Dakar, Senegal office. He joined ISS in 2017 as a senior researcher in the Peace and Security Research Program, after which he moved to ISS Dakar as a senior researcher. Before joining ISS, Fonte worked for the United States Department of Defense and the Council for the Development of Social Research. Fonte's research covers violence, governance, and human security in the Lake Chad Basin. He has a PhD in politics and international studies from the London School of Oriental and African Studies. Fonte ISS is also a member of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Program, which is a network that works closely with the Wilson Center. So Fonte, thank you for joining us today from South Africa. Our next panelist is Ambassador Bisa Williams. Ambassador Williams is the chair of the Board of Directors of Health and Development International, and she's a senior fellow at the Yale Jackson School for Global Affairs. She has also led the Carter Center's efforts as an independent observer of implementation of the peace agreement in Mali. Ambassador Williams' background is extensive, over 30 years of serving in the Foreign Service. In that time, she served on tours in Guinea, Panama, Mauritius, France, and also at the U.S. mission to the UN. Most recently, she was the U.S. ambassador as well to Niger. Looking forward to conversations today. And then, last but not least, is Ambassador Don Booth, who is the current co-chair of the Wilson Center Sudan's Working Group. Ambassador Booth served as U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan from 2013 until 2017, and again as Special Envoy for Sudan from 2019 to 2021. He also served as ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, to the Republic of Zambia, and to the Republic of Liberia. Also extensive years in the Foreign Service. I know that both of you are both retired from the service, so I will still say ambassador. It's forced habit. So as I go through this discussion. So thank you all so much. Looking forward to a robust conversation. So when I look in the Africa Year in Review publication, we have at least 7 or more essays that focus on the question of governance. It paints a mixed picture of where things are currently on the continent when we look at democracy and the fact that democracy is in distress in several areas, in several parts of the continent. Last year, we saw significant elections across the continent. This year, nearly 20 elections are scheduled on the continent. And just in January, I'm like, this is the second week in February. And so much has already happened in West Africa. So there is a lot on the governance front. Chidi, I want to come back to you because you had mentioned extensively about the extensive investments that the MCC has on the continent. And the fact that 2023 was also a busy year for this administration as they pushed to see the implementation of some of the pledges that were made during the US-Africa Leaders Summit in 2022. So this renewed engagement with Africa actually includes a lot of priorities that are at the core of MCC's work on the continent. But can MCC really expand its role and impact given the fact that on the continent at this time, we see a lot of the areas where you work in democracies in distress?
Thanks for that question. I think absolutely. as a first off, by statute, MCC only partners with countries that have demonstrated a commitment to just and democratic governance, investing in their people and in economic freedom. MCC's scorecard, that some of you may be familiar with, has a number of indicators that are objective, data-driven measurements of this commitment. And we've seen several countries adopt reforms with a specific goal in mind of improving their performance on the MCC scorecard so that they can become eligible for an MCC grant. The clear incentivizing effect of MCC's eligibility criteria is something that we refer to as the MCC effect. We've seen this effect in action in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, where the government has a dedicated team focused on strengthening its MCC scorecard performance, which resulted in the country being selected for bilateral and regional compacts over the last few years. We've also recently seen countries such as DRC take up this mantle as well and put into their government their own reform unit to be able to try and reach the MCC effect. The other side of the coin is that we have to back up our words with action. And in some countries where we have seen democratic backsliding, such as Mozambique and Sierra Leone, MCC continues to engage with the government, civil society, and a range of stakeholders to encourage dialogue and reform. In other countries, MCC has had to walk away from or suspend programs due to democratic decline, and in fact, MCC has ended approximately 25% of the compact programs it has begun due to democratic declines. This includes such countries such as Burkina Faso, where we had to terminate our programs due to the number of coups that overthrew democratically elected governments. And in Niger, MCC recently suspended its assistance due to the coup last year and is working to encourage a return to democratically elected governance. These decisions are difficult for us, but necessary steps to uphold our model and emphasize an emphasis on democratic governance. But more importantly, I think MCC is always ready to engage when we see a positive change in a country's democratic trajectory. And while MCC ends its investments due to flawed, maybe 2015 or 2016 elections, we are able to still select countries like Tanzania for threshold programs in recognition of positive trajectory reforms on democratic governance under particular governments or presidents that are trying to change the trajectory of where their democratic governance challenges may be. So those are just a few examples of how I think MCC can continue to be a part and also expand its role in the governance space.
Thank you very much, Chidi. I'm sure that there will be folks in the room who will have comeback questions for you on that. But let me move to Fonte. Fonte, I think we've already said, the outlook for democracy on the continent is mixed. As I said, in January, we saw 3 countries in ECOWAS put in a request to leave the regional group. Already over the weekend, we see the events unfolding in Senegal with the postponement of the election dates. In 2023, likewise, early 2024, the continent is facing a lot of security and governance challenges. And with the number of elections that I'd mentioned earlier that we have scheduled this year, the continent will once again, democracy and governance will once again be put to test on the African continent. How is the African Union? I know the ISS does a lot of work with the African Union. How is the African Union faring amid these challenges? And how should the US engage with their African counterparts on this issue?
First off, I would definitely like to commend the Africa program at the Wilson Center for another remarkable Africa Year in Review, which has been really comprehensive as well, and to which the ISS was delighted to contribute. You ask a very important question, which starts off from the premise that Africa, like the rest of the world, is currently in flux. And understanding the context on the continent at the moment through the prism of flux actually allows us to ask a number of questions. The first relates to collective security arrangements within a context of flux, because that's exactly where the exit, or as we describe it, Rexits are taking place. You mentioned Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger applying to exit from ECOWAS, but also there is Sudan, which requested to be suspended from IGAD as well. So it's not a situation that's limited to West Africa. It also translates to the Horn of Africa. However, against the backdrop of this Brexit, we also ought to acknowledge the fact that in the past 2 years, the East African community has actually expanded with the inclusion of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Federal Republic of Somalia. So in fact, there are ways in which the collective security arrangements on the continent are being tested. And the request by the 3 countries, of course, has received the response from ECOWAS as well, saying they need to put in, it has been submitted now, but they need a year to actually still maintain their obligations. And hopefully during this year, they would be able to come to an understanding which avoids a fracturing of ECOWAS, which for a long time has actually stood as an exemplar of regional economic communities. At the heart of these requests to exit are 2 issues. The first one is the question of unconstitutional changes of government, which speaks to state-society relations on the continent. States are as much in a process of formation on the continent at the moment as societies are. And against the backdrop of demographic opportunities, which Chidi identified, and technological transformation, geopolitical movements as well, there are a number of tectonic forces which affect governance on the continent. At the end of the day, the big question we're asking ourselves, particularly in relation to the African Union, is whether we are entering a new era of African solutions to African problems. What that means practically is, are the instruments and norms of the African Union adapted to the context within which we're operating at the moment? Of course, we need to note that the African Union started a reform process in 2017, which led to the coalescence of the political affairs and peace and security departments. The question we need to ask ourselves is, does that provide a robust enough architecture to actually support early warning and transform early warning into early action on the continent? At the moment, the verdict is still out. The second question that we need to ask is how the African Union actually operationalizes subsidiarity in a context where regional economic communities are suffering from a credibility and legitimacy crisis, which is advanced by the member states of these organizations themselves. And the third question that we need to be asking ourselves and taking very seriously is how the African Union truly operationalizes the ambition for Agenda 2063, where we are actually launching the second 10-year implementation window at the moment. It aspires towards an integrated, stable, and transformed Africa. But how does that work for the 1.4 billion citizens of this continent? That's the big question. A lot of the coups that you have referred to are described as popular coups. If you go by Afrobarometer, they point to the fact that in a place like Mali, the military remains fairly popular. So in fact, if these coups are popular, what are we missing in terms of the US engagement with these countries and by extension their citizens, the relationship between state and societies in Africa, and the relationship between public and private sectors, the role of institutions and the strength of institutions to actually shore up the democratic process, and the sanctity of elections. I would like to put these on the table as reflection points, but the AU is definitely caught between challenges and difficult responses or ill-adapted responses at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fonte. You've definitely laid a lot of questions for us on the table to think through. I like that point you made about Brexit. I'm going to steal that one. But you know, the point you made about if these coups are popular in the region, what are we missing in terms of our US-Africa engagement? Ambassador Williams, let me come to you. For those of you who haven't seen the publication yet, and I'm guessing everyone in this room has read the publication already, the last publication, last but not least article in the publication is on Niger. And Ambassador Williams, you paint a positive picture of something that has happened, of an event that has occurred in Niger. This isn't typically the case when we talk about the Sahel. No. Very often, it's the insecurity, it's the conflict, it's the crisis, but you actually show an example of progress. What are the opportunities for these bright spots and examples like this that you've pointed out in Niger? How can these examples help reinvigorate or help us rethink or reimagine how we engage in the Sahel?
Well, thank you, Ogi, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I was humbled but delighted that you decided to include my short essay on saving African women's lives in that fabulous review of the Africa Review 2023. The reason why I think it was so important, yes, when we refer to the Sahel, often things are looked at through a security prism. Often things are cast in a negative light. And in particular, in speaking about Niger, everybody knows I was former ambassador there. I have a certain attachment to the people there, to what was going on, and was very concerned about the coup. However, I feel that it was really important to highlight, although this initiative took place in Niger, my whole point in the article is saying this is something that can be done elsewhere on the continent. This is about African women. And it is almost a cliche in our circles to talk about it's very important to invest in women and girls in Africa. You build the village, all that. There's a lot of talk to that, but not the right kind of investment, in my view, and not the sustained investment. So the point of that article was to say, with just a little over $500,000, that in a population of maybe 20 million people, you could save thousands upon thousands of lives. And this is relatively cheap. This is really cheap. The conversation that has to happen is in understanding that this priority. Everyone has a women and child, maternal health line item on their budget on the continent, but it's the kinds of things that are sustained and backed up are not given the right kind of priority. So how can this be, how can we duplicate this or replicate this in other parts of not only the Sahel, but other parts of Africa by showing proof positive using the infrastructure. This was not an importation of any kind of great infrastructure from outside, but it was a matter of building on the expertise in the health ministries, building on the entire social health infrastructure from the confidential person or the person of confidence in a village, to the ambulance driver, to your midwives, all the way up to the ministry, to just explain a process to which all of these health ministries have access. So my idea, the idea is there are now on the continents, particularly in the Sahel, you have capacities. What we need to do is build on top of those capacities and use what are their priorities on saving lives, saving families, helping. When you know that you save the health of the woman, you educate the woman, the whole community becomes more stabilized. So I think in just presenting affordable, doable, accessible examples, that can be replicated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Affordable, doable, accessible examples. Mm-hmm. I'm going to remember that one. Thank you. And Ambassador Boot, let me come to you. You also have a really, really good article in the in the publication on Sudan. And as we know, since the crisis broke out in Sudan, April 15th of last year, it's been ongoing, and there's also the critique that this crisis is not getting the desired attention required, and that also civilian voices have not been included effectively in the ongoing negotiations or discussions. Drawing from your article and from ongoing discussions, what are some concrete examples that you can offer, or concrete steps that can be taken by the U.S. and other partners to effectively include diverse Sudanese voices in the discussions needed to inform actions to end the fighting in Sudan?
Well, thank you, Oge, and it's delightful to be here today on this panel. I think to answer that question, we need to start with why is it important that civilians be included? And I think you have to look back a little bit into Sudan's history. At independence in 1956, there was already a rebellion in the south underway. And while Sudan at independence had relatively well-developed institutions, including civilian institutions, unions, political parties, professional associations, academia, the country, because it was fighting a rebellion from the beginning, I don't think it's a great surprise that the military as an institution became the preeminent institution of the state. And by 1964, we had the first of many coups by the military. But the problem is that that military rule has made Sudan a very brittle state. They've lost a third of their territory with the independence of South Sudan after two very lengthy multi-decade struggles. And really it has created the fighting in Darfur that began in 2003, led to the creation of the Rapid Support Forces, which now, of course, is partly responsible for the division of the country. So cobbling together another military dominated government, and one where the military, which over the years has basically come to dominate the economy as well, is sort of, looking to do the same thing and hoping you're going to get a different result. So I think this is why it's really important that civilians be at the forefront of the future of Sudan, be involved in the negotiations of peace, involved in the negotiations on security sector reform, and involved, obviously, in the political configuration of Sudan going forward. So what can the U.S. and others do to actually promote this civilian participation? So first, I would say that you need to work on all those who are offering external forces that are offering mediation or facilitation. There are unfortunately far too many of them. None of them have really gained traction. The U.S. is involved in one with Saudi Arabia, the Jeddah process. But they need to be unified, and whoever ends up taking the lead, IGAD tried, and the Rump government in Port Sudan didn't like where they were going and their reception of their enemy, General Hemeti and the RSF, so they've withdrawn from IGAD. They've objected to the African Union. But whoever comes to lead this, I think it's imperative that the United States and others make sure that the facilitation truly understands and is committed to having civilian participation. It's not just enough to give it lip service. We went through this in the South Sudan negotiations in 2014, 2015, where IGAD finally agreed under great pressure from us to include civilians in the talks, but then quickly backtracked as soon as the warring parties, President Kiir and Riek Machar, objected to the civilians being an independent voice. The second thing, I think, is to pressure the armed groups if they flat out refuse to accept participation of civilians. Now, we don't have a lot of leverage over the armed groups, actually, not directly anyway. So this gets to the reason, the need to work with those who are supporting the armed groups and trying to get them to better understand why civilian participation is important. And thirdly, we need to cajole the civilians to actually agree to a diverse representation. Sudanese civilian groups tend to be very self-selecting, and they tend to get smaller and smaller the closer they come to actually participating in governance. And so this will be very important, and they need to stop squabbling over who should sit at the table. And finally, as true national unification, and Sudan is divided at this point. So true unification is going to require the support of a vast majority of Sudanese. And it's really time and imperative that we understand their diversity and what their priorities are. So the Wilson Center Sudan Working Group is contributing in some small way to this. We've started a 4-part series where we're trying to bring a diverse range of Sudanese civilian voices to address a couple of questions. The one we had last month was to address how they think pressure can be brought on the generals to stop the fighting. The next one we will do this month will be on civilian views as to how best to configure any peace process, peace negotiation, political negotiation. The third one will be the civilian role in security sector reform. How do civilians think they can play a role in that? What is it that they're looking for? And finally, how to get regional actors to take civilian interests on board. And I think that will probably be the toughest nut to crack, as most of the external actors are not particularly societies that are open to civilian voices in their politics. But if I could, I'd just like to mention one other thing in terms of over the past 19 years, I've worked very extensively on 5 African countries: Liberia, Zambia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan. And one common theme has come up. Now, it's not unique to Africa or to these countries. I think it's pretty much a global theme, but it's really that political leadership really matters. It makes all the difference. And particularly that leadership when it's focused on trying to build national unity and overcome diversity. 2 of those countries, I think, have done a fairly decent job. Liberia's post-Civil War leaders have agreed to 2 peaceful transitions of power, and in the process, they've really helped reduce the divisions, whether it was settler, indigenous, book, non-book, coastal, upcountry. And frankly, I'm not surprised that George Weah did concede that he lost the election. Back in 2005, when he lost that election, I had a long, long discussion with him. He had expected to win. He sent his supporters to the U.S. Embassy to protest how Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had stolen the election from him. But after long conversations, he's a reasonable, thoughtful person, did not want to put Liberia back into conflict, and he conceded in that election. So when he did it this year, or last year, I was not particularly surprised. Zambia still benefits from the focus of its first president, Kenneth Kaunda, who repeatedly kept stressing, in his words, one nation, one people, one Zambia. He devoted his time in office to building this nationhood, despite the very arbitrariness of the colonial borders that Zambia inherited. And now we have a president from Western Zambia, a minority, who could have imagined that this would be the outcome. Ethiopia, a much more mixed bag. Ethiopia's got a long history of expansion and contraction, and when the leadership has tried to exert control by force, it has always been very short-lived. Prime Minister Meles Zenawi came up with a new novel solution to try to address Ethiopia's diversity, called ethnic federalism. It was very much maligned by many, but under that approach, they did have basically a decade of about 8% annual economic growth, and it was fairly well distributed around the country. I would suspect that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, after the conflicts in Tigray and the ongoing uprisings in Oromia and Amhara, is also really looking at this issue of how do you address the diversity. Sudan and South Sudan obviously have failed in this effort. And again, it's the leadership really that I think has been absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Don. And I'm looking at the time, but I have another round of questions before I open it up to the audience for questions. So I'll ask you all to hold on to your questions for a bit, and I'm going to go around again with another round of questions for our panel before we open it up. I was also reminded that for those of you who are on social media, you want to follow these conversations online, you can follow using the hashtag Africa Year in Review. So to pick up on all the comments that have already been made, so as the world changes, and Chidi, pulling from some of the points that you made in your remarks, as the world changes today, so does Africa's role in the global arena. In several essays in the Africa Year in Review publication, it shows that Africa's institutions and interests are gaining priority in ways that affect international politics and U.S. foreign policy. In fact, the Wilson Center has just come out with a new Wilson Center, Wilson Quarterly, that examines global alliances and how different alliances across the globe are changing. One that I would definitely encourage everyone to pick up if you have the time to read it. As we look at these changing roles, we also look at U.S.-Africa trade relations. Those were in the spotlight last year with conversations around AGOA and thinking about the reauthorization of AGOA as this is set to expire in 2025. So, Chidi, with a lot of the infrastructure, the investments in infrastructures you mentioned that MCC makes on the continent, we know that FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, is set to take place this year, and China remains a big player in infrastructure development in Africa. As I mentioned, infrastructure comprises a major part of what the MCC does on the continent. So what makes MCC able to make and sustain large-scale infrastructure investments on the continent this year and looking ahead?
Sure, I'll be quick in the interest of time. So I would invite you to learn more about MCC's model, but I think to your question, we all recognize that developing countries will face urgent infrastructure needs as well as enormous financing gaps. And at the same time, developing countries have a greater variety of potential sources of development finance than ever before, and these options are of varying quality. Presented with competing development approaches, development finance has become a strategic issue, particularly for African partners who are looking for a partner to choose from, or partners to choose from. I think MCC's high-quality assistance and grant giving responds to countries' real needs by providing critical grants and financial critical infrastructure, and that these needs are designed to be cost-effective investments shaped by an evidence-based analysis to ensure measurable returns on investment. It's a long-term investment that's not just providing dollars, but it's also providing a way of instituting not just good governance, but democratic rights, learning and teaching how to contend with anti-corruption as a prerequisite to be receiving this funding. So it has not just a long-term effect, but it has an ingrained and embedded sort of partnership outcome that happens as well. And I think the MCC model specifically is important to counterweight China's approach, and it comes as a refreshing, I think, option, particularly because of our country ownership and the country-led response that comes with the programs that we developed. Our high-quality grants are, as I noted, come with a particular emphasis on structuring a particular model of the MCC structure, which is building its own coordinating mechanism within the government. They develop a similar architecture with a CEO. They have a governing board. And all of this provides a secondary effect that is long-lasting after the infrastructure project may be completed. Again, getting to the institutional part of the partnership that the U.S. and MCC has with the countries that it works with. Again, going back to the country ownership piece of it, it allows countries to develop something that they actually need and is not given to them with the threat or the concern of leftover baggage, we'll just say, that might come with other donors or partners that they work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for those points, Chidi. And Fonte, let me come to you, just following up on that conversation. So last year, we saw the BRICS Summit happen on the continent, and there are a couple of articles in the publication that reference BRICS. So we see the growing influence of BRICS nations in Africa, especially following some adjustments and some announcements that we saw last year around AGOA. And some countries that were impacted by some of the adjustments that were made to the trade program. So given these new conversations that we see on the continent with shifting alliances, the growing influence of BRICS countries, African countries seeking to diversify partnerships, are African countries defining, or is Africa defining the rules for international engagement?
That's an interesting question. I think African countries are on the path to actually redefining some of the rules of international engagement through partnership diversification, as you clearly identified. However, it's interesting to look at it from how Africa is engaging and what platforms Africa is using to engage. The first is within a context of growing global tensions, which are masking the fact that the US and China have basically been in trade wars for close to the past decade. Africa is presenting itself as an option and a trade beacon through the continuous operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So that platform actually provides the potential for different kinds of engagement beyond infrastructure with the African continent. And it's also important in the AFCFTA is the question of currencies of exchange between African countries, because as you know very well, going from Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire, basically you use different currencies. So that's a preoccupation of the FTA. The second is the issue of moving away from the more structural and state-driven issues is the simple question of trade, industry, and demography, right? And labor. Africa still has quite a huge pool of unskilled labor. How does that labor actually feed into global production chains, as well as it feeds into African production chains as well? It's a fundamental question for the continent, and it's one which is going to continue to gain currency as when we look to the global north, we have an aging Europe and a young Africa right across its border. The third consideration with BRICS is definitely that of the entry of the expansion of BRICS from 5 to 9. but also the role of new players beyond just the trade and economic and social spheres to the area of defense and security as well. Those sort of interventions on the continent are having implications for the duration of wars, the nature in which wars are executed in places like the Horn of Africa. And it's very important to keep an eye out for those dynamics that connect particularly the Horn of Africa to the Gulf states. Finally, when you look at Africa's positioning in the world in a changing global context, it's also important to introduce the issue of artificial intelligence because the AU is considering it's actually in the process of putting together a strategy on artificial intelligence as well. Why that matters, in fact, is because it would have implications for labor, production, and industrialization. Most African countries argue that they need to move up the manufacturing chain to get into supply chains and raise their GDP as well. Africa has to move from an extractive continent to a productive continent. So those are some of the issues and preoccupations with Africa's positioning. However, that would need to be based on a comprehensive posture, which is not just driven by singular African countries, but firm positioning on industry, manufacturing, climate, and trade at the level of regional economic communities, but also at the level of the African Union. The final point I would like to make is the African Union's inclusion into the G20 definitely provides tremendous opportunities for the continent as well going forward. And the G20 provides a platform through a critical question for Africa can be handled, the question of debt. At the moment, close to 24 African countries are in a situation of potential debt distress. In Africa's relationship with China, we mentioned infrastructure, but linked to that infrastructure is a great amount of debt. So how Africa engages China on that debt, how the Paris and the London clubs engage Africa on debt is going to be defining, in fact, more important than just the social grants that are being transferred from the smaller middle powers. And I think that would be the sticking point for the BRICS countries as well. China, as a huge holder of African debt, what offer would it put on the table to address that thorny issue? It's fundamental going forward. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Phonte. And Ambassador Williams, if I come back to you, this discussion on alliances and forming new alliances and Brexit, as Phonte had raised, what are the impacts of these actions, this move that we see by countries, as we've seen in West Africa, Horn of Africa, to leave these regional economic buddies? And how should the U.S. engage in this new reality?
Well, thank you. Actually, I think Phonte has already hit on a really important point when it comes to Brexit and what's going on in the basic instruments that we use in the international community. I think that's really what's being called into question. If you want to look at ECOWAS specifically, I'm not sure that we know yet what are really going to be the full implications of the withdrawal, not the request to leave, but just the escape, let's say, or the withdrawal, point blank, of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from ECOWAS. But because they have stated quite clearly, we're not going to go through the regular procedure. We're not giving you a year notice. This is effective immediately. So that's been able to happen, as was already alluded to, because of the lack of credibility already, or the diminishing credibility of some of the member states within ECOWAS, the inconsistent responses to similar situations, and the sort of sleight of hand that we have seen by certain governments in manipulation of their own rule of law or their own governing structures. So within the ECOWAS states, when you saw that sort of fluidity or volatility, the initial withdrawal of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, while it looked like it was an affront, actually, there really couldn't be that much protest against it or contesting it because of the communities, in my view, because of their own inconsistencies. I think what is happening in the Sahel specifically is that while I don't really trust the ambitions and the motivations of the actual coup leaders, their activities have forced a more open discussion of what populations are expecting of their government. Mm-hmm. And Don alluded to it when he talked about the importance of civilian engagement. And Fonte has already alluded to it when we really talk about what's the language that we use, what are the tools that we have used to say this is how you have a democratic state and this is what a democratic state is supposed to deliver, versus what's been the experience of the masses in this region. Mm-hmm. And there's been a clear disconnect. Like I said, I'm not convinced that the military leadership in the three countries that right now that have exited ECOWAS, I'm not pretending that they are the political stars and leaders to take their countries in the right direction, but it is obvious that whether they wanted to or not, their populations now are having more open discussion about this. And the challenge to United States policymakers and other donor countries or would-be friends of these countries, democratic friends of these countries, is to see if we're all having the same conversation. I'm not convinced, for example, in the instance of Niger, I'm not sure that the U.S. government and the people of Niger and the junta in Niger were really all involved with the same language in the same conversation. And I think the United States, my personal view, which is obviously subjective, in the example of Niger, I think the United States lost an incredible amount of credibility in its perceived, my words are kind of harsh, but it's perceived fumbling in that situation. However, I cannot, you cannot ignore, in Mali, for example, there does seem to be sustained popular support of what's going on, of the junta, while there's still visible and also public criticism of shutdown on the press and on public speaking, free speech. So if your issues if you're getting to your question of, so how do we look at the structure of ECOWAS and what's it going to mean for the region? The ECOWAS states have got to have this political class, this political clan has got to have a more legitimate discussion of what leadership really means, how much they are supporting their democracies, because there's clearly not a consensus within their own body, number one. And number two, I think there has to be a better communication there's been a big gulf has emerged or become more apparent, it was probably always there, between what we do call as a political elite and the people that they're governing. Mm-hmm. And as policymakers, we tend to stay in this stratosphere of the leadership. I mean, Don, one of you just made that political leadership does matter. Yes, it does. But unless you are engaging civil society and unless there's a constant involvement of civil society, not so much let's consult with them on the side and then carry back their message to that small echelon of political leadership, but they've got to be in the room. They've got to be part of this process. I'm not sure that we have created the instruments that are necessary in order to make that kind of thing happen. So I think that's what the next step is as we look at what is that regional bloc that started out as an economic regional bloc, expanded into a political wing that says, yes, we're going to support all democracies, and then decided we're going to pick and choose which democracies we're going to support depending on how much Western education we've had, what other kind of exposure we've had to our friends, and how large our armies are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really key points that you've made. And Don, just last question, and I know you touched on this a bit in your initial, in your response to the first question I had when you were talking about external actors. And today on the continent, it goes beyond, just China and Russia that everyone talks about, but there are middle powers as well. From Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, there's so many other actors that are involved on the continent. As we look at Sudan in particular, and the fact that you referenced several external actors there, what opportunities, if any, are there for these external actors to work with the Sudanese people or in partnership with others to address the crisis that we see there?
Well, there's quite a range of external actors that have gotten involved in Sudan. As I wrote in my piece in Africa Year in Review, a divided Sudan really is in no one's interests. Unfortunately, I think a lot of external actors haven't quite come to that conclusion yet. And some may simply be spoilers and never will come to that conclusion. But if you look at the neighbors, the immediate neighbors, what have they seen since April 15, the outbreak of fighting? Massive influx of refugees, economic disruption, and even some spillover of fighting. South Sudan in particular is really walking a tightrope because the pipeline, it gets its oil and therefore its economic lifeblood out to market is part of that pipeline is controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, General Hemeti, and the oil terminal at Port Sudan is controlled by Sudan Armed Forces, General Burhan. So, they have to be very careful. So economic disruption potentially could be catastrophic for South Sudan if this war continues. A lot of other states, I think, are seeking to increase their political influence and have long been looking at Sudan as a great place for investment. The breadbasket of the Middle East has often been talked about. Countries of the Gulf that really can never feed themselves, given their geography, climate, have often looked to Sudan as the place to invest in agriculture, but also in minerals, oil as well. So are they served really by a divided country that will probably continue to be unstable and conflict? Or can they be convinced that trying to find a way to bring Sudan back together is the way that suits their interests? And yes, they're competing with each other to a certain extent. Some of the Gulf states are. But I think they need to be brought around to see that there are win-win solutions, as the Chinese like to say. For those countries, and I put the U.S. in this category, that are really more focused on the humanitarian aspect of the conflict, on the human rights aspects of the conflict, again, how do you address those when the conflict is raging? The best way to get humanitarian aid into a country is when there's peace, or at least when the warring parties are cooperating with you. The only way you're ever going to end atrocities is if you can end the fighting and then begin to engage those who have been committing those atrocities in the past. I think it's important to look at it historically, that Sudan, as I said, has been at conflict pretty much since independence. These conflicts have never resulted in an outright victor. John Garang and the SPLM North didn't defeat the Sudan Armed Forces to gain South Sudan's independence. That was done basically through a negotiation process, and South Sudan was not the objective, frankly. It was the new Sudan was the objective, a unified Sudan. And unfortunately, John Garang died, and that vision, I think, tended to die with him, and we ended up with a divided Sudan there. But there's no reason to expect that there will be a different outcome in this conflict. No reason to expect the Sudan Armed Forces will defeat the RSF or vice versa. Sudan can achieve peace when those who are facilitating the fighting recognize that their interests are best served by peace. And so that's where I think really our focus needs to be. You know, perhaps the path to peace in Sudan lies not so much in trying to get the warring factions to the table right now, rather than to get the external actors, the middle powers and others who are involved, the neighbors, around the table and trying to figure out how their interests can be addressed by peace in Sudan. And then you have collective pressures on the warring parties and everyone else in Sudan to resolve the conflict. Mm-hmm. And finally, again, going back to the multiple offers of mediation, facilitation of talks, it's important that there be unity of effort. The worst possible outcome is to allow for forum shopping. This happened during the South Sudan negotiations in 2014-15, and it really, frankly, prolonged that conflict unnecessarily.
Thank you very much, Don. So we're going to open it up for questions. We have about 25 minutes for questions, so a good time for questions. So if you have a question in the room, oh, wow, okay. Okay, so, and I see we have a couple of questions online, from online as well. Okay, so what we're going to do, we will take 3 questions in the room first, and then have you all answer and take another set of questions. My colleague Niat has a microphone here, so why don't we start with you, Saman, in the middle. And please, when you ask your question, please keep it a question and identify yourself when you ask the question, please. Keep it brief. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Oge, and thank you to the panelists for a really brilliant session and discussion. My name is Samah Sanman. I'm from Sudan, and I'll just build on the last remarks by Ambassador Booth. I did read your essay, Divided Sudan in No One's Interest, with great interest, and agree with you on all of the premises. Sudan is a country of great potential. There's been a huge failure of leadership and inability to manage the diversity, which has led to the secession of South Sudan. Getting to the question, Oge, you write, a military stalemate remains likely and would create a long-term division of the country. Just delving into that a bit. That is one of the undesirable, scenarios. Is that, are you saying that could be a de facto division of 2 states within a state, similar to Libya? Or do you think that could be a really more severe division, partition, fracturing of the country where you have, balkanization of east-west, north-south? And I just wanted to understand your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Saman. Let us take, we can take the question with the gentleman in front. Please keep the question brief.
Thank you very much. My name is Winston Ojukutu Macaulay Jr. I'm from London, originally from Sierra Leone. My question, I've listened to the panelists talking about China, Russia. But one thing taken from what Ambassador said is that American government and also by extension the European Union tend to fail to understand that right across Africa, including North Africa, majority of people tend to want the liberal democracy practice in Western countries, i.e. Europe and America. And yet, as the ambassador said, the governments within America and Europe tend to deal directly with the political elites rather than engaging proper civil society rather than civil societies that support the political parties. Why do you think that continues? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And we'll take the question in the back. The next round will come to this side. So we'll take the
Hello, I'm Yasmin from Search for Common Ground. And one of my questions is, we've been talking a lot about insecurity and especially like in the Sahel region. So we work a lot on digital peace building and fighting online hate speech and misinformation and everything. So my question is directed to Chidi, but anybody else can answer it. How is the MCC working on digital transformation in the Sahel and in countries like Nigeria, for example? And how are they helping the continent with digital transformation. So.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 clearly laid out questions, one on Sudan for you, Dawn, the last question for you, Chidi, and then Ambassador Williams, if you could take the question from a colleague from Sierra Leone. And
Want me to start?
yes,
Okay.
and responses brief as well.
We'll try. I think, as I said, I don't see any clear-cut military victory by either side. Therefore, you're going to have a de facto division of the country. Is it balkanization? That's a real possibility because you don't just have the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces. You also have the SPLM North. You have the Sudan Liberation Army of Abdul Wahed controlling different parts of territory. And the longer this conflict goes on, the greater the possibility that, if you will, warlords, to use a term, could indeed lead to a certain balkanization of Sudan. I don't foresee a de jure separation, a further separation of Sudan. I don't think, again, anyone really wants to see that. None of the African partners, the African Union certainly is very much against further division of countries on the continent, as well as the United States, and I think, frankly, the Gulf states as well. So this balkanization is indeed a possibility. And again, that certainly would not serve the interests of neighbors who are looking for stability, investors who are looking for opportunities, and others who are looking to alleviate the humanitarian suffering, because it's just way too complicated to deal in a balkanized context.
Thank you, Dawn. Chidi, you want to go next?
Sure. So in answering what MCC has been doing to support the digital transformation, as part of our work, we have a digital skills strategic vision in ensuring that there is digital information, literacy, and education that is shared with our partners. And it's not in every particular program that we have, but we are making a concerted effort as we think about the future and as we think about where we see not just the continent going, but I think globally where we're going, that the information space is one of the most challenged spaces to be able to contend with what we're seeing with misinformation, disinformation, artificial intelligence, and ensuring that the partners that we're working with on the ground have an element and understanding of the ecosystem or the digital ecosystem is something that we're ingraining in our work. So I'm actually headed out to Tanzania next week, and we'll have an opportunity to visit a DigiLab program that we did 8 years ago with Tanzania. And that program has grown to continue to educate youth, women in some of the rural areas, and we're looking for an expansion and seeing the expansion that the government of Tanzania has been able to do with this program that was from years ago. Also in Cote d'Ivoire, we've been working with US ADF Bank on their DigiFem program. This one is particularly targeting digital literacy and education for women at the rural level as well. As given to Bisa's point about when you educate girls and women, that knowledge is often shared and exponentially grows. And so these are just small examples of where we are working in that vein, but it is a core part of what we are trying to continue to enhance as part of the larger infrastructure compact. This digital infrastructure and this information technology infrastructure, while it's not a hard brick and mortar thing, it is something that needs to be at the crux of our partnership with the next generation, but particularly at civil society, civilian, and rural areas.
Thank you, Chidi.
And on the civil society, and to be fair to my former colleagues in the State Department and Foreign Service, the U.S. government does tend to do a lot of public outreach and work with civil society. We have American corners all over the place. We invite people in a lot to have public conversations, and things get sort of compartmentalized. I will say U.S. government tends to have a great public discourse and exchange with civil society. What happens for me, the stalemate, which I saw, for example, in Mali, when it comes to the problem-solving part, for example, the Carter Center, I was leading the Carter Center effort in observing how the peace agreement was being implemented. the only people involved in the actual implementation. This is after the peace is negotiated. It's like, okay, how does this manifest in the country? You would think civil society would be brought in, but we still were talking with rebels and government, and it was the Carter Center that insisted civil society's got to be part of this. It's part of the implementation, the manifestation of this. So I think, again, going back to instruments, what's the vocabulary? What are the traditional meeting rooms and protocols that we use with various sets of problems? I think that's what has to be reorganized, restructured, and just renewed in this millennium. Because our old tools aren't working. So I don't want to suggest that that Americans, as a policy or as a government, don't engage on civil society. I think that flies in the face of all reality. But I do believe that we are not comfortable yet. We, as the policymakers and state-to-state interlocutors, have not figured out how do you partner with somebody who's not really the state? How do you engage them on a level of equality and real partnership in order to make something work? And that's the challenge before us.
Thank you very much. Before I come back to the room, we have some questions from our online audience. Unfortunately, I will not be able to take a second round of questions from online. I will just take these ones here and pose them to everyone in the room. These two questions are specifically for you, Fonte, and others too as well, on China-Russia relations. So last year, we saw 17 cabinet and USG officials visit 26 countries across Africa with a focus on expanding partnerships. However, it may seem that African countries are still pivoting towards China and Russia. Why is this the case? And what is the U.S. missing in its engagement? I think partly for you, Fonte, but others on the panel could also contribute. Then there's another question here too as well on what are the important implications of the AU designation of the African diaspora as its sixth region? And the last question, which goes to everyone, can the distinguished panelists offer some suggestions to help move Senegal out of the current political crisis? So Fonte, would you like to start?
I'll be very quick. Linking the question about what the US is missing with Africa's pivot towards the East and to the question about liberal democracy that was asked by Winston from the audience. The first is democracy is in crisis globally, which means African countries are actually exploring alternative models to not just governance, but development. The second is African countries are increasingly looking to success stories in Southeast Asia because of what they see as historical commonalities in terms of development approaches to development potential. That's the second. The third is the fact that there is sort of this perception that there's been engagement historically with the West. And the power pendulum is currently shifting towards China to become the largest global economy. And Africa wants to be, a lot of African countries want to benefit from closer partnerships with China. So, I mean, it's an important question. What is the US missing? I'm not I think when you look at the US strategy for sub-Saharan Africa, the first challenge is the focus that it gives to contesting Chinese and Russian influence in Africa. There's a lot that the US could actually market beyond contestation of the others, which drives up competition on the continent. The second is the US and Europe have a lot of cultural ties with Africa in terms of what the people want as well as what their aspirations are. Not necessarily in terms of governance, but also in terms of lifestyle. So how can that be exploited by the US? The third is We often use this as a measure of the popularity of specific countries within the countries in terms of the perception of opportunity. You need to go look at the backlog of visa requests to Europe and the US compared to the absence of backlog of requests from Russia and China. Now, Russia and China are actually catching up by making it easier for African students, particularly, to access their universities and spaces of higher learning. So how does the US actually continue to be that citadel of learning and capacity building for Africa's present and the future? I think those are fundamental questions, and there are opportunities there as well. The designation of the diaspora as Africa's sixth region is a recognition of the fact that you cannot perceive brain drain, the question of brain drain, without looking at the potential to gain from the remittances and the family ties that actually transform livelihoods on the continent. The second is the opportunity that's presented by returnees, or what I described as repats on the continent, of which I happen to be one. So those opportunities exist, and for the AU designating the diaspora as the sixth region, it's actually recognizing Africa's potential is not limited to the continent or circumscribed geographically, but is actually global in nature. And I think it's a very important way of actually encouraging investment by the diaspora into Africa's transformation. I'd leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Fonte. And I will, the question on Senegal. What can you all offer in terms of some suggestions to help move Senegal out of its current political crisis?
Pregnant pause.
I mean, mine is really short. It's like, I think, get elections back on track as soon as possible. I think that people have waited for a democratic process to be able to elect the next leader that will, take Senegal into its next phase. The sooner the Constitutional Court can get the ruling on whether or not the extension is appropriate and legal, the sooner the elections can get back on track. I think that would be my advice.
Thank you, Chidi. Anything else
Yeah,
there?
I concur.
If I may, okay.
Go ahead, Fonte. Go ahead.
A reading of the situation is the statement that was put out by the State Department has actually been very well received, better received than the statements that were put out by either ECOWAS or the AU. So the call for a rapid return to the democratic order in Senegal is actually important. The second is to track the early warning signs for potential destabilization from the security establishment as well. That's a route which we would not want to go. And the third would be to continue to get civil society momentum, because this is one of those points where if you look back about 12 years, the same dynamics basically shrouded the transition from Macky Sall, from Abdoulaye Wade to Macky Sall. So what lessons can we draw from those contestations 12 years ago that would inform this current process? It would be important to base sort of interventions and engagement based on some of those lessons learned as well. And there's really opportunity and potential to get to elections before what the ministerial meeting yesterday described as the 14th, if I remember correctly, of December. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll come to the room. We have about 5 minutes.
Lightning round.
5 minutes. So I'm going to take all the questions. If you have your hands up, we'll take the questions. Please keep your question to a question. You have 20 seconds for your question. And I'm sure there'll be time to catch up with our panelists if you have a few minutes afterwards. But please keep it to a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Forgive me for not standing. My name is Ni Akwete. I am on the faculty at GW and also a university in Accra, Ghana. My question will be directed to my brother in South Africa, Fonte, and Ambassador Williams. If I misunderstood what you said, please forgive me, but I was dismayed because I thought we are saying, we are implying that coups are popular. So the question is, how do you judge whether a coup is popular or not? My argument will be that the best way to know what a group of voters or citizens want, you can do polls, you can see them dancing in the streets, but the best way is have them vote and you count. I have been through like 7 coups personally, not that I caused any, but, but that I was swept up in Kumasi, in Accra, in even Abidjan. And so when the soldiers have guns, you will do what they want. It doesn't mean you like it. So I think it is very dangerous to think that soldiers are alternatives to politicians. The solution to bad politicians is better politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Nee. The lady here.
Good morning. My name is Ramatulai Jallo. I'm at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. My question is for Fonte. I actually read an ISS article that was critical of the inconsistent approach of the AU to the military coups. And the recommendation in the paper was to have a more consistent approach. But I wanted to ask, because the coups in different countries require different responses, how do you maintain the balance between pragmatism, flexibility, and also maintaining the norms that are under the AU as they currently stand? Thank you.
Thank you, Ramatu. I see 2 more questions, so you and the gentleman in the back.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a wonderful panel. My question goes to two ambassadors and to Ms. Blyden also. We all agree, and as you can see while you were talking, we're all nodding to a lot of things that you were saying. The U.S. is not really engaging the African continent in full force as it's supposed to, and you know that has placed the U.S. at the back burner with China and Russia and all these smaller powers. So my question on that is, what are we seeing, you are seeing, that is not translating out there, and how can it be changed? Because if we keep up this way, we all know that, you know, when we bring the African continent against the rest of the world, there are 2 evils out there, but there is a lesser evil. And that lesser evil is what the African continent should be looking to. But the leaders are looking for something that would deliver today for them, whether it is for personal, political aggrandizement.
I don't want to cut you off, but we have to move on to the next question.
Then my question is, the MCC keeps pulling out. Is there anything different that when the MCC pulls out for its statutory policies and things like that, is there anything that replaces the MCC to keep this engagement that I'm talking about going with the US and the African continent? Because the African continent is a lot different.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next question in the back.
So do you think US made a big mistake by not getting involved in Ethiopia when there was the Ethiopian-Somali war? Because Somalia got support by Russia. And at that time, we were obviously in a Cold War with them, but Ethiopia didn't get any support from US. I mean, do you think US would have supported them at that time? We could have stabilized a lot of things in those areas if we could have done that. And also BRICS, do you think it's stabilizing? Because now there are 9 members, but 5 of them are now actually under authoritarian coup laws, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudis, and China, Russia. So now BRICS has actually become more of a authoritarian coup kind of dictatorship kind of association.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for all your questions. As our panelists respond, please, I ask that you include your closing remarks as well in your response. So we will start with Fonte. Let's start with you.
So in closing and in response to both Ni, who I respect very well and very much, and Ramatulai, 3 things. I'm not saying that coups are popular. I'm saying that coups in all of the countries where they have taken place were predictable, they were preventable, and we could have provided better responses. And you just need to look to Mali, Niger, Guinea to basically see exactly how they're predictable and preventable, which explains the way in which they were received by populations. And after that initial euphoria, of course, there's disappointment, because there is buyer's remorse. But initially, the conditions that led to the coups made them very predictable and preventable. The second question about sort of one size fits all approach, that's actually not the call. What the call is, we need to have similar responses for civilian-led unconstitutional changes of government, which themselves trigger coups, and military coups as well. Because changing the constitution alters the political landscape and creates a sense of elite capture by a specific group of individuals. And that's been one of the biggest complaints in West Africa, that you had situations where constitutions were changed in Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, and ECOWAS did not react. But then the military took over and they reacted. Mm-hmm. So I'd leave it at that for now. And it's been a pleasure to participate in this panel, and looking forward to the next Africa Year in Review as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Fonte. Bisa?
Well, I would almost echo what Fonte said. The idea that coups are popular was not my main point either. I will say that I was in Mali on the first coup of this. This is a two-part coup that's gone on in Mali, and the crowd brought on, like, this was predictable, but actually the crowd invited the military. So each country is different, and where they stand now might be a little bit different. But I think it's important for us to recognize there is something different happening on the continent, and there is, maybe in an ideal world, the answer to bad politicians is good politicians, but there is such deep suspicion, and in some cases, rejection of the political class. What some African youths are asking for is a different kind of a class. Is it the religious group that's going to come through? Is it the new entrepreneur that's going to come through? Look what the United States did. I mean, so I'm not sure that everybody would say, yeah, we need a better kind of politician, because that's the whole question mark.
Thank you, Bisa. Don?
Oh, and also thank you for including me on this.
Don, few seconds.
Sure. You said the U.S. is not engaging Africa full force. I think the Biden administration has certainly increased the force with which it's engaging in Africa, given the number of visits and the amount of resources that are being devoted to the continent. I think one of the real issues is the U.S. has been seen as sort of the status quo power. One of the most used words out of the State Department in my career was stability. And I think stability, if you see it, if you're in Africa, and the last thing you want is the status quo. You want to see things improve. We would look at stability as being the necessary basis for investment and economic growth. So there's a bit of a talking past each other that's been going on. Briefly, to address your question in the back about the U.S. and the Somalia-Ethiopia war, I mean, this is going back quite a few years. We supported Ethiopia. Ethiopia had a revolution. Somalia invaded. The Soviet Union went in to support Ethiopia. There was a reversal of alliances. We supported Somalia. At the end of the day, I don't think it really made any difference in terms of where the Horn of Africa has ended up. I don't think you can go back that far and try to make a determination. Okay. My final remarks would be, in Sudan and in Africa, I think what the U.S. really needs to do is to be really listening to Africans, to how we can help them get political leadership that unites rather than divides, that shares rather than hoards, and that builds rather than destroys.
Thank you, Don. Chidi?
I'll be really quick. The scorecard that MCC uses is a mutually joint agreement between countries where MCC works. They know what indicators on the scorecard they have to pass before we enter into any compact or threshold. That's how they have become eligible for those. So they are as much accountable to ensuring that their government stays on those particular factors and indicators as we are for helping them institute and implement the programming. So the reason we do our programs over time is so that there is continuity of accountability from one administration to another if there is a proper and good democratic transition when a particular compact that MCC offers actually gets enacted into force. In the case of countries where they have had to lose or suspend or pause a program, there are steps to be taken to get back to the scorecard eligibility, and many of the countries have done that. Many of them have started with our threshold program, like a Sierra Leone. So, for example, started with a threshold program, was able to continue on, improve their scorecard eligibility, and then with what we call the MCC effect, have now been eligible for a compact. So it's a long-term process that really allows that. I want to also thank the panelists and Doge for having us here. I'll quickly touch on what the U.S. offers is very, very different than what other partners may offer. We stick to our values. While it's not the status quo, it is stable and it is something that can be counted on and relied on, but we are also being innovative in our newer approaches. And I think to someone's question earlier about the sixth region, the diaspora, the President's Advisory Council on the diaspora is for this very reason. We cannot do, I think, our work without being able to access and influence and talk with the diaspora here in the United States and on the African continent and around the world. So we implore all of you who are very interested in this subject and who consider themselves to be diaspora as well to continue to engage, invest, and grow with Africa as well.
Thank you very much, Chidi. And with that, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel today. Obviously, there's a lot that lies ahead in discussions in Africa, challenges and opportunities this year, and we hope that you all stay engaged in the discussion. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.